Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Recovery Summit presented by St. Clair County Community Mental Health with support from St. Clair County Health Department. Today's presentation is on Addiction 101. Before we begin, we would like to go over some general reminders. Please use the chat feature for all questions or comments. Our presenter will be answering questions as time allows. Today's presentation offers one social work CE and one MCBAP credit. If you're requesting professional credits, you must remain on the webinar the entire time for credit. A survey will pop up following the conclusion of the webinar. Those of you that are requesting social work CEs, completion of the survey is necessary. And now I would like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Alex Elswick is a tireless advocate for people with substance use disorders. He currently serves the University of Kentucky as an assistant professor and extension specialist for substance use prevention and recovery. Alex is a trained researcher, recovery coach, and mental health therapist, as well as the co-founder of Voices of Hope, a peer-driven recovery community organization. But most importantly, Alex is himself a person in long-term recovery from the chronic disease of addiction. Welcome, Dr. Elswick.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all so much for having me. I tell people all the time when I get to present that you really don't need to thank me. I should be thanking you because this is exactly the nature of my job. This is what I get paid to do in some sense, but also it's what I want to do with my time. If I wasn't here hanging out with you all talking about addiction and recovery, I'd probably be downstairs bothering my partner doing the same thing. So you're probably doing us a service this morning. I'm Dr. Alex Elswick. I'm a professor at University of Kentucky, where I teach about drug addiction and drug policy and drug prevention. And I do research mostly on long-term recovery. I usually describe it to folks like, what are the ingredients of the recipe or the pieces of the puzzle that need to be in place for people to really sustain a meaningful kind of long-term recovery that leads to improved quality of life. And I'm a person who has had the opportunity to learn about substance use from a lot of different experiences. So you heard some of that in my short bio there. I have clinical experience as a marriage and family therapist. I have nonprofit experience, co-founding Voices of Hope. We're a recovery community organization, so we're not a treatment organization. We don't hire clinicians or, God love you all, social workers. All of our staff are people in recovery. They're peers who use their lived experience to help other people in recovery. And we fill lots of important gaps, and they're gaps that I think will be much clearer to you by the end of the presentation today. Addiction 101, alternatively titled Addiction is a Chronic Disorder, Treat It Like One. In addition to the clinical experience and the nonprofit like service provision and the research that I get to do every day, all of that gives you a unique vantage point on substance use and addiction. But without a doubt, the most important experience I have is personal experience, because I'm a person in long-term recovery from an addiction to Oxycontin and to heroin. And what I want to do is start by sharing just a little bit of my personal experience. And I don't want to get carried away with a whole testimony. I've got so much more that I want to get into. But I think it's helpful to start to frame our discussion. And then I also wanted to give one other disclaimer, which is, the title Addiction 101 might seem misleading. It might seem like we're talking about things that are so obvious and basic. And that's not exactly the case. There are definitely things that are fundamental that we want to talk about today. But even if you're a person who's worked in this space for a long time, I genuinely believe there's something here for you. So give us a chance and stick with me on this. I'm going to speed through disclosure and objective slides and just start sharing some experience. So I was born and raised here in Lexington, Kentucky, to really fortunate circumstances. My dad's a doctor. My mom's an accountant. I grew up in the suburbs. I went to private school. Nothing bad ever happened to me as a kid, but I inherited some risk factors. And the first was a genetic predisposition for addiction. My mom had 7 uncles, 4 of whom had drug and alcohol problems. And even though I didn't know this as a 13-year-old, I got to graduate school and it became clear to me that my risk was elevated from the time that I was born, before I ever made a bad decision or snuck out of the house or whatever it was. And then secondly, from the time that I was young, I've struggled with anxiety. And I always tell people up until the age of like 12, I was the happiest, most well-adjusted kid on the planet. And if you had used my first 12 years of life and extrapolated that into the future, you would have said Alex is going to have it easy breezy. But starting about 12 or 13, as I started to go through puberty and adolescence, I got some of those, those cascading hormonal changes. I got a chemical imbalance somewhere along the way, and I started to experience symptoms of anxiety. And I ended up being diagnosed with 3 different anxiety disorders: generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and trichotillomania, which is a hair pulling disorder. For my clinical folks, you'll recognize trichotillomania. For me, it was my eyebrows. I plucked all my eyebrows out when I was in like 7th grade, just a maladaptive coping response to try to address my own anxiety. And so those anxiety disorders, one thing that's really important to note is they didn't get diagnosed until I was 22 years old and at my 2nd treatment center. And so what that meant for me was I spent a decade of my life, and probably the most significant decade of my life in terms of my own human development, struggling against this disorder that I didn't even know I had. And what I mean by that is I always tell people, like, no one needed to tell my body that it had anxiety. I knew that I was feeling something that wasn't quite right, but I didn't know that anxiety was a clinical condition. I didn't know that like 20% of any room was struggling with it, and that that there was a course of treatment and chronic disease management and yada, yada. So I started coping how I could. I played baseball and basketball and golf in high school. And the older guys on the baseball team dipped tobacco. And when I was 13, I was desperate to have a fat lip like the cool upperclassmen. So I started dipping tobacco. And I'm going to tell you something. I liked the way that nicotine made me feel a lot. And that sounds like a funny thing to say, but it's an important thing to say, because up until that point in my life, all that anyone had ever told me about drugs, the sum total of my understanding of drugs is drugs are bad, drugs are bad, drugs are bad. And my first experience with nicotine, and then my first experience with alcohol, and then cannabis, they were all positive experiences. And so immediately my parents, educators, all those folks lost all their credibility, because I figured they just didn't know what the reality was. And it made me curious about other things. And I never really liked alcohol, but I loved cannabis, and I loved the way that cannabis took the edge off. So this is, I'm bringing pictures for you all today, which is really special. This is me about 18 years old, just lost as I could possibly be. I had the chance to go to college to play baseball, and I got into that freedom and that kind of independence of being on my own. And one unique feature, I guess, for me of my social anxiety is I'm pretty comfortable with people once we're in relationship, and I understand the boundaries of our relationship. I understand kind of the rules of engagement. I'm anxious first establishing those and negotiating those boundaries, which other people seem to do intuitively. It makes me anxious. It's part of what characterizes my social anxiety. And so I say that to say going to college and having to develop new friendships was hard for me, I think. And as my social anxiety ratcheted up, so did my cannabis use, and I started smoking all the time. And then I started smoking so much I couldn't afford it. And on Valentine's Day, so I started selling cannabis, and it started really small and innocent. And then it kind of got away from me, and I started selling other things. And then Valentine's Day 2010, I got pulled over because my brake light was out, and I got arrested on a whole bunch of felony drug trafficking charges. And trafficking 8 ounces to 5 pounds, trafficking within 1,000 yards of a school, possession of a controlled substance, possession of paraphernalia, DUI, tail light. They charged me with my tail light being out, right, on top of all the felonies. I went to jail, and jail was a bad experience. And I got out of jail, and I got kicked off the baseball team, and I got kicked out of the college. And I have this really vivid memory of walking across Center College's campus, crying my eyes out, going to clean out my dorm room. And at the time, the narrative in my family, the way that we made sense of this whole experience was like, Alex is a good kid who's made some bad choices, right? There was no discussion about mental health. There was no discussion about addiction. It was always about choices. It was always framed in that moral sense of choice. And about 2 months into probation, I had surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed, and I got prescribed oxycodone. And despite the fact that I took it exactly as it was prescribed by my provider, I got addicted to it. And I ended up with like a 30-day supply of opioids for a pretty minor outpatient procedure. And got sick when the prescription ran out and didn't understand why, because I couldn't intellectually understand withdrawals, but my body knew, man, if I can get some more of that medicine, I can make this feeling go away. And in 2010, you all will recall, pills were being diverted all over the street. They were pretty easy to find. And so I started buying pills on the street. And I got back into college, and things seemed to be back on track. But on the inside, I was really just, an addiction was festering. So I'll fast forward just for the sake of time. By the end of 2012, I got off probation, and I had $150 to $200 a day addiction. And, I did a lot of awful things to support my addiction, things that are, not consistent with my character at all. But things that I did, as a kind of survival, I think, to get my medicine to be okay. And I think because of the shame of those things, I finally went to my parents and I said, I need help. I can't stop taking these pills. And it came as a complete shock. They had no idea that I'd been using pills uninterrupted for 2 years. And I started going to rehabs. And I mean rehabs plural, because it was the same pattern over and over again. And I'm guessing this is a pattern that's going to be familiar to a lot of you all. I would go to a 30-day treatment center. And during the 30 days that I was there, I would start to do a little better. Not a lot, but marginally better, right? My withdrawal symptoms go away, my cravings are reduced, my tolerance goes down. I seem to be doing better. And I leave after 30 days and my face is full and I sound good, and I relapse the next day. And my family's so mad and angry and shocked and disgusted, and they take it personally. And I can't understand why I would have done that. And then I go do it again. And then I go do it again. And then my parents tell me they can't afford to keep sending me to treatment centers if I'm not going to see it out. And I don't understand how it is that I'm not seeing it out, because damn it, I'm trying. I'm surely not having fun using drugs anymore. That left a long time ago. And I just couldn't make it stop. And so I ended up going in and out of treatment centers and finally refusing to go back to treatment. My mom had a bed for me at a place in Nashville. And I said, you know what? Treatment is suffering. And I'll explain some of the science behind that here in a little bit. It's misery. And so I'm going to go subject myself to 30 days of abject misery so that I can get out on the other side and disappoint the people I love. No thanks. I'm not doing it again. And so I moved to Cincinnati with a girl I was dating, and I got introduced to heroin and using a needle, and things got worse. And I promised I wouldn't share all these awful things, but I share one because it kind of galvanizes the story, or catalyzes the story, I guess. For one of our anniversaries, I'd given Lauren, this girl I was dating, a Tiffany's bracelet. And in August of 2013, I woke up in heroin withdrawals. She went to work. I started rummaging through our house looking for stuff that I could sell. And all I could find was that bracelet. And I took it to a pawn shop. And I got $50 for a $500 bracelet, because that's how that goes. And I spent it on heroin. And when she realized what I'd done, she kicked me out. And I went homeless, and I ended up spending time homeless in a few different cities, in Nashville, in Lexington, in Cincinnati, in Dayton, Ohio. That's the Highway 35 overpass in downtown Dayton, Ohio. I slept up under the bridge. I met a community of folks who were IV drug users, who were homeless. They showed me the ropes. They showed me where to get a meal and where to get a shower. And they told me about a Salvation Army, which is a homeless shelter that had a treatment component. And this is the day that I got dropped off at the Salvation Army. And man, it's a grainy photo because it was taken on an old phone. You just can't appreciate the misery there, right? But for the sake of time, I got to move on. The first 30 days I spent at the Salvation Army are the worst 30 days of my existence on earth. And I can say that with so much conviction and so much certainty and clarity. I know that it's miserable. There's a special scientific a word for it, a neuroanatomical word for it. I'll give to you in a little bit. That's really interesting. But it's miserable. And I, really slowly things started to change for me. I ended up spending 6 months at the Salvation Army, and that was critical for me. But then after 6 months at the Salvation Army, I had help transitioning into transitional housing. I had help getting a job. I had help getting benefits. I had help with my health insurance enrollment. I had help accessing a therapist, addressing my anxiety. I had help every step of the way. And all that stuff we call recovery capital. It's just the stuff of recovery. And so often we think that the stuff of recovery is a treatment center or an AA meeting. And that could very well be part of it. Those are like big bricks. in building this building of recovery, but we forget all the mortar. And the mortar is often a lot more fundamental, basic stuff than that. How stably is someone housed, right? Does someone have access not just to food, but to adequate nutrition so that their blood sugar is not going to spike and plummet all day long? Not a good thing for people early in recovery who are vulnerable to stress. You know, the list goes on. Transportation. Do they have meaningful social support? Social support isn't just, are you in a room where there are people? Social support is, are you in a position where you're able to access connection with people? Both because they're like you culturally and in terms of values and norms, but also because your body will allow you to connect with people because you've resolved your trauma or because it feels safe, you know? So I just want to conclude this by saying, I tell people all the time that there's nothing special about my recovery. It's a dime a dozen. I'm sorry, nothing special about my addiction. It's a dime a dozen. But there is something special about my recovery, and it's not me. And I promise I didn't gather you all today to say, hey, I'm special. I had special access to the things that I needed. I had special access to recovery capital as a pretty privileged person that most people don't have access to. And that was such a driving determinant in my ability to sustain a kind of recovery that leads to an improved quality of life. Real quick, before I transition into, getting into some science, I wanted to, I showed you all my shame. So I want to show a little bit of my pride. Did a ton of damage in my relationship with my family. And so this is every Wednesday, we would meet at the Waffle House at the Awful Waffle and just have breakfast and just connect. And it was, it's like a Waffle House is like hallowed ground for me for that reason. It was a really special place to get to do that. This is Voices of Hope at one of our overdose awareness events. Our complete staff, circa like 2017 or 2018. And today we have more than 100 staff. So we've just exploded in growth. It's the coolest thing in the world. And then last thing to share with you, at the RX Drug Abuse and Heroin Summit in Atlanta a few years ago, I got the chance to meet the president and do a speech with him, which was cool. But way more exciting for me was to get to sit on the stage and talk about recovery capital with some of the giants in the field. So that's Nora Volkow, the director of NIDA, Francis Collins, the director of NIH. And it's just, I put this up here, maybe partly bragging, I don't know, but I think also to legitimize and lend credibility to what we're talking about today. Recovery capital is something that's of interest to NIH and NIDA. This is some important stuff. So there's no good way to segue from my personal experience into addiction science. So we just parachute right into the middle of what is kind of, in many ways, the most contentious debate in the field. How do we understand addiction? How do we characterize it? And I think so often it's characterized, at least to the general public, but also in many cases to nursing students, social work students, doctors, lawyers, whoever else, as a false dichotomy. And we say, well, either addiction's a choice or it's a disease, and you got to pick a camp. And the reality really falls pretty squarely in between. Either you're both wrong or you're both right. I'm not sure which, but Nora Volkow essentially says, your brain is your choice organ. And so just like when your heart becomes disordered and it disorders the function of your heart, when your brain becomes disordered, it disorders the function of your brain. When we say, we talk about a mother choosing drugs over her child, it's not the same thing as choosing whether she's going to have turkey or ham on her sandwich, right? It's a choice that's constrained in a different way. It's almost like the word choice isn't even helpful there to understand what's happening in people's brains. And if all that does is serve to confuse you entirely, that's great. Because I like a defenestration, like we throw out the window the old and kind of start with the new. So what should we understand about addiction? Let's start with Rat Park. And maybe this is an example that some of you all have been exposed to before, but it's my favorite way to couch the discussion. So a lot of what we know about addiction comes from research done in the 1950s. Researchers put rat in a cage, gave it 2 sources of water, and one was plain water, one was water laced with morphine. And over again, the rats return to the water laced with morphine, and they use it to the utter neglect of their basic needs. And they stop eating food, and they stop drinking the healthy water, and they stop interacting or bonding, mating. They don't want to do any of that. They just want the morphine. And so for a short time, this becomes our really myopic, oversimplified model for understanding addiction. And we said, okay, if any of us gets exposed to a drug like morphine, we're going to get addicted to it, and we're going to use it until we die. But about 20 years later, some other researchers came along and said, it's not a great study. because putting rats in cages is not an accurate reflection of the way that people use drugs in the real world. So they created Rat Park, which you see on the left side of your screen, which is like heaven for rats. I always tell people it's like if you and I were rats, this is prime rat real estate right here. You got gerbil wheels to exercise on and toilet paper rolls to crawl through, and you're in this thriving community with all your rat buddies, and then they replicate the study. They introduce the same two sources of water, but in Rat Park, the results are completely different. The vast majority of the rats don't like the water laced with morphine, and those who do use it in complete moderation. None of the rats die in Rat Park. And this is important. None of the rats die in Rat Park, despite the fact that they had freely available access to exactly the same drug in exactly the same dose. And so we like to make a monster out of drugs, and we act like drugs cause addiction. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not true. Part of the evidence is process addictions, the fact that the same changes happen in the brain when you're addicted to gambling or pornography or even your tanning bed. But part of what this shows too is that environment matters a lot in shaping outcomes. In Rat Park, the rats had attractive alternatives. They had better things to do with their lives than to mope around in isolation and use drugs. And so they chose those other things, as people frequently do. And so people criticize that study because that's just what we do in my line of work. We just pick on each other. And they said, hey, that's a cute rat study, but we can't really generalize those results to human beings. And interestingly enough, there was a naturalistic experiment being carried out at the very same time in terms of Vietnam, because you had an entire cohort of soldiers go overseas and fight in horrific conditions. And reports are coming back to DC that something like 10 to 20% of actively deployed US military in Vietnam are daily heroin users. And so you can imagine all of the fear and the consternation in the White House. What will be the social and economic consequences of a fifth of our military coming home addicted? But instead, what happened was, just like Rat Park, the soldiers left the cage. They left that horrific environment in Vietnam. They came back stateside to Rat Park, to loving families, to meaningful employment, to thriving communities. And the vast majority of those daily heroin users, like 97%, never used heroin again. And it's just another example that drugs don't really cause addiction. Addiction really is caused in the brain. Drugs can be a stimulus for addiction, but so can many other things. In fact, there are some researchers who would argue that the trichotillomania, the disorder of hair pulling that I've struggled with, really is just an addictive disorder in the same way. So it's just interesting to think about. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. Again, for the sake of time, let's run through risk factors. I know you all are experts in this stuff, but I just want to highlight these are the most important things to be reminded are actually causing addiction in our communities. It's not bad choices, and it surely ain't bad people. The biggest one is genetics. I know this slide is really busy, so if it's giving you a headache, just focus on me for a second. The way that we determine the genetic contribution to any disorder is through twin studies, typically. You can take monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, and it's a really convenient way. If there's a higher correlation of addiction between monozygotic twins than dizygotic twins, then you know that genetics are responsible. And so ultimately we find about 50% of the variance in addiction is explained by genetics. That's kind of fancy statistical researcher speak for saying essentially half of what causes addiction is genetic. And probably all of you already knew, yeah, there's a genetic component to addiction, but you need to put that number in perspective because breast cancer is also genetic, and about 8% of the variance in breast cancer is explained by genetics. And in addiction, in drug use disorders, it's 50%. So it's incredibly genetic. And that's unfortunate because that's a non-modifiable risk factor. There's not, at least at this juncture in scientific development, not a lot we can do about that. The first real modifiable risk factor is mental health. About 40% of people with substance use disorders have a co-occurring mental health disorder. But I think a more helpful way of looking at that is like this. If we went into the general public in your community, about 13% would endorse, yes, I've had a problem with drugs at some point in my life. But if we went to your local hospital, to the psychiatric unit, and we gave the same survey to folks with severe mental illness or even folks with garden variety anxiety and depression, that rate of addiction would be more than doubled to 27%. And this illuminates a really important point. It's something we call the self-medication hypothesis, which is actually kind of intuitive, I think. The idea is like, hey, we do a terrible job of treating mental health in this country. I think you all probably are the true experts understanding that better than anyone. And in that gap, we have millions of people who have untreated or undertreated mental illness. And consequently, they seek to self-medicate in lieu of the treatment that they're not getting, and self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. Another major risk factor to consider is trauma. And I think one of the most overlooked aspects of trauma is the trauma of addiction, is the trauma of the experience of substance use disorder, and then also the Christmas tree of vulnerabilities that it exposes you to, right? Just a cascading tree of consequences. Certainly the things that I experienced when I was homeless, I mean, all these things are traumas, no doubt, but what I wanted to focus on today is childhood trauma. And so you all are probably familiar with ACEs. Kids who have just one ACE drink alcohol at an earlier age. They're more likely to misuse or use prescriptions. And kids who have just 6 or more of these ACEs are 46 times more likely to use drugs with a needle later in life. And the reason that's astounding to me, the first time I saw that stat, I remember having the thought consciously, that must be so rare, because that's a tragedy of a childhood. But that is truly spoken from a posture of privilege, truly spoken as a person who didn't have that experience, because I'm sure what my social workers on the call here understand well is how these ACEs cluster together. We've already established a connection between 6 and 7. About 40%, give or take, of people with SUD also have a co-occurring disorder, but we also know that we've criminalized SUD in this country. If you have a substance use disorder, you're probably going to be possessing a drug. If you're possessing a drug, it might be an illicit drug, which leads you to be incarcerated. So really quickly, we've added up 3. You can see how those conspire against a kid. Last risk factor I want to mention, by no means the last risk factor in existence. You all know that. There are many. I just wanted to focus on the most salient ones to keep them in the forefront of our minds. And that's environment. And we alluded to this when we talk about Rat Park. But if you wanted to control for genetics, so if you wanted to set aside not the genetic impact on addiction, but you just wanted to say, what's the impact of growing up in an environment where the parents use drugs, have a substance use disorder? Those kids are 8 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder themselves. So now we could really easily add up everything that we've just talked about and index risk factors. And you can think of kids or adults, folks you've worked with, who are examples of the deck that they were dealt really conspired against them. And what's important to know is these risk factors determine what kind of an experience you have with a drug. And I recognize a weird way to talk about drug use, but one of the points I want to drive home is about neurodiversity, that we all have different brains. And that necessarily means we're all experiencing the world around us differently. It's hard to imagine a little bit, but it's the reality. And so it's never more true than in the case of drug use. I hope this isn't like a grotesque example, but if we were to pass a joint or a bottle around this virtual space, we wouldn't all experience it the same way. Some people would get really paranoid and it would be upsetting. Some people would feel very little and would say that was a waste of time. And some people would get comfortably high or drunk or whatever it is. That has a lot to do with our chemistry. It has to do with all the factors I just told you and more, right? All of those things shape how we experience a drug. So in fact, some people are genetically predisposed to have low dopamine tone, which means their first time they're exposed to a drug, which triggers the dopamine reward system, they're going to have an especially positive experience. And as you can imagine, that's going to be a huge risk factor for addiction. If the first time I used a drug, it was the greatest experience in my life, that's going to be a problem for me going forward, right? And so now what I want to do, even though I bet many of you have seen something like this before, I still think it's really worth it. And maybe this is a different way of explaining it. I heard somebody say once, insight is merely a rearrangement of fact. And so hopefully you can get some insights from maybe just me rearranging some facts that you already know here about the brain. But fact number 1 that you probably already know is that that's not actually your brain on drugs. That's an egg in a frying pan, and it's not a helpful illustration of your brain on drugs. We are going to talk about your brain on drugs, and I know this is really cheesy and corny, but do it with me anyways. Put your palm out in front of you like this, and tuck your thumb into your palm, and wrap your forefingers around your thumb, That's a little brain right there. All right, you can put that down. If you talk to an evolutionary neuroscientist, you talk to somebody who studies the way the human brain has evolved throughout human evolution, they'll tell you that our brains have evolved inside out. So in other words, the four fingers there represent the cortices. This is the most highly and recently evolved part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that separates us from other species, that positions us at the top of the food chain. It's the part of the brain that develops last in human development. So those of you on this call who have adolescents who make stupid, irrational, impulsive decisions on a regular basis, it's really not their fault. They're all gas and no brakes, right? They're too limbic. But if you peel back the layers of the cortices, you go more towards the middle of the brain, you get to a part of the brain called the limbic system. And it's sometimes also called the survival circuitry because it's considered the most important circuit in our brain for our survival. And it's so important to understand this in order to really understand addiction. So first I'm going to explain it outside the context of addiction, and then we'll apply it to addiction. So anytime you do anything that confers evolutionary benefit, so you do anything that makes it more likely that you're going to survive another day. You eat food, you drink water, you have sex, you try to reproduce, you bond with another human being. All of these behaviors are rewarded in your limbic system. They're really rewarded through the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which you all have heard of, at least in pop science, I'm sure, the feel-good motivation reward neurotransmitter. And so I think of it like potty training a dog, because I got a Cavapoo puppy a couple of years ago. And when we potty trained him, he'd go to the bathroom outside and we'd hit the clicker and we'd give him a treat and we'd say, good boy, right? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to reinforce that behavior. In so many ways, it's like our brains potty train us for survival because we're not that smart on our own. We need our brains, right? And so our brains are like, I take a bite of a banana and my brain tosses me a dopamine treat. And my brain is like, Alex, that's a good boy. And so now the next time I see the banana, I'm going to be like, banana good. I eat banana, right? It's a fundamental thing that shapes our behavior. It's an elegant system, but it's a nightmare in the context of addiction. So when we talk about a hijacked brain, that could be a little bit misleading, but that's effectively what's going on here. And I'm going to start by explaining this with words on the screen, which I know is impoverished and people won't like, but I think it's helpful to start there. And then I'm going to give you some graphs and some brain scans and all kinds of fun stuff. So at 18 years old, I was exposed to a substance, opioids, and I experienced a huge positive reward. DA represents dopamine. So I experienced a huge dopaminergic response. In fact, an unnatural dopaminergic response. And I use the word unnatural deliberately there because there's no behavior that I could engage in the natural world. No amount of food, water, sex, anything that's going to precipitate the same dopaminergic response that I got from that drug. That has a lot to do with my genetics. It has a lot to do with the power of opioids, a number of things, but huge positive reward. So here's why that's important. We just talked about the brain. My cortices, the highly evolved part of my brain, probably knows, hey, this is not an important to our survival. That blue pill or that brown powder is actually just a drug, and you're just getting it for kicks. But my limbic system has no way of understanding that. My limbic system only perceives the world around it in terms of dopamine. And to my limbic system, more dopamine necessarily means more important to survival. So after the first use, even though I am by no means addicted after the first use, not how addiction works, but after the first use, my brain is already engaged in a deep learning process of understanding that this blue pill or this brown powder is necessary for survival. And that's a problem. And so I'm inclined to repeat the behavior, but where addiction really sets in, ironically, is that our brains try to adapt to help us, but that compensation actually causes addiction. So you might think that my brain likes those spikes in dopamine every time I use a drug because that's euphoria after all. It's a good feeling, right? But remember from science class that my brain and my body doesn't like all that volatility. My brain likes homeostasis. It likes to find a balance. And so my brain kind of catches on and it goes, okay, Alex, every day we're taking this blue pill, this brown powder, and we're getting these exogenous, these external blasts of dopamine. So what I'm going to do as your brain is I'm going to stop producing as much dopamine so that tomorrow, when you take that blue pill, that brown powder, instead of going way the heck up here out of whack, it's just going to bring us into balance, right? And the irony is it's the brain's attempt to compensate that actually causes addiction. It's what causes tolerance. It's why the first time you got drunk when you were 15, you took 5 sips of Boone's Farm and you were tipsy. And now that wouldn't even, it wouldn't do anything to you. So here's my graph for thinking about dopamine in the brain. It's a little bit rudimentary, but I think it's helpful. So 0 to 10 in terms of dopamine units, 0 means none. That means you're miserable. 10 means, you're as good as you've ever felt. 5 is a baseline. And so I wake up at a 5, and at 18 years old, I got exposed to an opioid and I got a huge dopaminergic response, an unnatural dopaminergic response. But eventually the effects of that drug wore off and I returned to baseline. So I'm inclined to use again. It felt good. So, the good feeling, the euphoria alone might make me want to use it again. But also the fact that I got a dopaminergic response might mean it's important to my survival. My brain might already be learning that a little bit. I use again, but the effects of the drug wear off. I return to baseline. Now, all that I've graphed for you so far is drug use, not drug addiction. This is essentially what happens in all of our brains when we use a drug to one extent or another. Where addiction sets in, as I told you, is that my brain doesn't like this volatility, so it compensates on its own. It dissolves to some extent or shrinks dopamine receptors such that now when I use a drug, I still feel really good, but I only get to a 9, right? And so when you talk to people who have lived experience and they talk about chasing the dragon or chasing the first high, they're not making it up, and it's not a psychological phenomenon. It's a neurochemical phenomenon. They are losing dopamine by the day, becoming increasingly miserable, chasing the high increasingly, liking less and less, but wanting more and more, which is a dirty catch-22 of neuroscience. And now, just as importantly, when the effects of this drug wear off, I don't just return to baseline. Now I come down below baseline. And so for the sake of argument, we're talking about somebody at this juncture who is early in their addiction career, right? Probably doesn't have any legals, probably no social consequences, probably no one even knows that they've begun using something. But even at this early stage, they've got multiple motivations to use again. Because not only does it feel good, not only their brain might think it's important to survival, but also they feel bad. They feel a little bit irritable, a little bit anxious, a little bit depressed, a little bit demotivated when they don't have that drug on board. And so that really kicks off. It launches that self-reinforcing, positively reinforcing cycle of using and coming down and using and coming down. And over days, weeks, months, years, right? Chronic drug use leads to the point of dopamine downregulation where you have to use a drug to feel the way you used to feel when you woke up in the morning. That's functioning addiction, right? I worked for an attorney in downtown Cincinnati at the end before I went homeless the last time. And I was wearing a suit and tie to work every day and shooting heroin in the bathroom. And to the untrained eye, that sounds absurd. How could I even be a halfway competent employee doing that? But when you understand the neuroscience, you understand I was waking up at a deficit and I was using heroin to get to a place to function for a period of time at least. Certainly not a sustainable model of functioning. And now eventually when the effects of that drug wear off because you can't get your hands on your medicine, because you choose to be abstinent, because you're incarcerated, whatever it is, that's a special kind of misery. And I've been hinting at that throughout, but there's a special word for it. And the word is anhedonia. So an means not, and hedonia means pleasure. So it means no pleasure. It's referring to a brain that's unable to experience pleasure from the world around it. And that's what it is to be addicted. And I think so many of us who, even though we understand lots about the behavior of addiction, we haven't understood that plumb the reality of having an addicted brain by its very nature, by its very definition, is to be miserable in a kind of misery that most people can't appreciate because most people haven't been that deprived of dopamine in their lives. So this is a really cool way of looking at it. This is the same thing. We're still looking at this dopamine downregulation process in the brain caused by chronic drug use, but we're looking at PET scans. So it's just a fancy kind of neuroimaging, positron emission tomographies, they're called. The brain on the left is a normal, healthy, controlled brain. And the brain on the right is someone who's been using cocaine, probably has a stimulant use disorder. And you can see this really stark contrast. You can see that brain on the right is a miserable brain. And that's compromised in every sense of the word. And this is the phenomenon that we see with virtually all drugs of abuse. That includes nicotine, that includes cannabis. So despite the fact that I became such a lover of cannabis as a young man, It pains my heart to have to admit to young people, the reality is cannabis absolutely is addictive, the same as any other substance, because it's not just drugs that are addictive. We see this same dopamine downregulation process take place in people who overuse cannabis. The same general misery start to take over if you overuse too much. But just to drive home my point that drugs don't cause addiction, this is a PET scan looking at dopaminergic activity, but the brain on the left is not a healthy control in the sense that it doesn't use drugs. In this case, the healthy control is someone whose body mass index, their BMI, is considered healthy or normal. And the person on the right is the brain of someone whose BMI is considered obese. And what you can see here is the very same phenomenon has taken place. I grant to you that it's not as stark a contrast as in the case of cocaine, but I always tell people, like, cocaine's probably a little stronger than carbohydrates, right? Makes sense. But the same phenomenon is happening here, compromising choices in the same way, right? So it's just not always about the drugs. It really isn't. It's about the brain, and that's what we have to understand. It's really what we've only begun to understand since about the year 2000. So even though I know most of you all know withdrawals well, you know that withdrawal symptoms are the opposite of the effect of the drug. Really, I just put this on the screen to call your attention to that last word, which is anhedonia. It's that word I mentioned earlier. And it's a symptom of withdrawal because when your brain has become accustomed to having a drug to give you those dopamine spikes and all of a sudden it doesn't have it, it's a special kind of misery. It's hard to get motivated to do much of anything. So a lot of the people we call in treatment or who are incarcerated, and we refer to them as non-compliant, that's pretty harsh because the reality is science would say they lack the neurochemical they need to be motivated and compliant in some sense, right? I'm not just trying to excuse behaviors, but these are real explanations. And so often people ask me, well, why would someone relapse? Why would they return to use? Why would they make that choice, right? After 30 days or 90 days or God forbid, 10 years. And part of the answer, there's a complicated set of reasons why people return to use, but the most common reason is misery and stress. Is they have a brain that's still recovering, that's still pretty miserable, it's still bereft of dopamine, and they're more susceptible to stress, more vulnerable to experiencing stress than the average person. And so this is the last brain scan I want to show with you, but it's by far the most important. In this case, we're looking at methamphetamine users instead of cocaine users. The drug doesn't matter a whole lot, because it's not about the drugs, you all. It's about the brain, right? The brain on the far left is the healthy control brain. The brain in the middle looks identical to the addicted brain that I showed you earlier, but here's the catch, and this is a really important catch. I actually played a dirty, dirty trick on you. That's not actually the brain of someone who's addicted in the middle. It looks like it. That's actually the brain of someone who was addicted, and now they're 30 days abstinent. So for the sake of argument, we can imagine that brain in the middle is the brain of someone who just graduated a treatment center. And oh, by the way, what does the term graduation suggest? What does that imply, both to the person graduating and to everyone else? It signals they're done, they're finished, fiend, right? And I think you all can see the apparent problem with that. Look at that brain in the middle. That brain is not a healthy brain. That brain lacks dopamine. That's disordered. When we talk about a substance use disorder being a brain disorder, that's what we mean. That brain is disordered, and consequently, as Nora Volkow taught us, their decision-making is going to be disordered. So we can blame them for bad choices if we want to, but the reality is they lack the apparatus they need in some sense to make those good choices. So here's the hopeful part. That brain on the far right is the brain of someone who was addicted to meth. Now they're 2 years abstinent. And what you notice is that brain much more nearly approximates the healthy control brain. That brain is beginning to heal in some meaningful sense. That's a person who's reordered, right? Recovered. And so the point to drive home here is that addiction is a chronic disorder, that this is a way longer term than we ever understood. And I mean, in all of our defense, we didn't understand any of this until about 2000, right? AA has had its own conception that's not too far off in some sense of addiction as a disease, but it certainly didn't understand this and the consequences of protracted changes to the brain, long-term changes to the brain. I'm gonna have to skip a slide there. So let's look at recovery rates really quickly. Blue bars represent males, orange bars represent females. This is the likelihood that someone's gonna recover based on how long they've already been abstinent. So for people who've been abstinent less than a year, so we're talking about folks who've just left treatment centers, only about 35% maintain their recovery. On its face, that might seem a little pessimistic, but if you compare that to rates of recurrence, rates of relapse for other chronic diseases, like diabetes, like hypertension, like COPD, like asthma, those rates of symptom recurrence are always somewhere between 40 and 60%. And so addiction, substance use disorder is roughly consistent. Somewhere between 3 and 5 years, we see a plateau effect where someone's likelihood of sustained recovery is above 85%. Their likelihood of relapsing is below 15%. That's a significant marker. And it means that what we have to do is create not more intensive models of care, but more extensive models of care, right? And so I'll give you a sense of what I mean by this. It means that treatment alone can't be the only solution, because treatment is so finite. Treatment is acute. And this disorder that we're talking about, substance use disorder, is a chronic disorder. So you've probably seen the consequences of mismatching a chronic disease with an acute treatment before, but I described it in my own story. It's people going through cycle after cycle of treatment and relapse and treatment and relapse and being blamed for it the whole time. Addiction treatment is the only kind of treatment where when the treatment doesn't work, we blame the person and just say it was their choices. Isn't that awful convenient? We don't do that with heart disease patients. We don't do that with people who have diabetes. It's only people with substance use disorders for whom we provide insufficient care that's mismatched to the nature of their disorder. And then when they become symptomatic, when their brain is disordered and makes disordered decisions, as it of course will, we shame them. We put handcuffs on them. We take their kids from them. We tell them they're terrible people and that they're choosing drugs over their kids. And it's not true. It's not true. So I know this is not very eloquent, but I always use my hands and just say, look, if it's a chronic disease, it requires a chronic response. So my favorite example of this is about 6 years ago. My dad had a heart attack and it scared me to death. And we rushed him to the hospital and put an emergency stent in, and it saved his life. And you all, that's an acute, putting that stent in is an acute treatment, an acute response to my dad's chronic heart disease. And honestly, he was fine. And we probably could have just stopped there and put the stent in and wheel him out of the hospital and he's good to go. But it's not what happened. So pay attention to what happened. During the 72 hours that my dad was hospitalized, someone came in to enroll him in 8 weeks of cardiac rehab to strengthen his heart. And then within a week of leaving the hospital, someone called to ensure he filled his prescriptions. A week after that, someone called to ensure he wasn't having any adverse reactions to his medications. A month or two after that, he had his first follow-up with a cardiologist and then his primary care provider. That's called chronic disease management. And there's nothing about that that's shocking or surprising. In fact, what the hospital knows and what the insurance company knows is if they had let my dad back out the door with chronic heart disease, resting on the laurels of just that acute treatment of putting a stent in, they know he's going to come back in 5, 10, 25 years with another heart-related condition. And the insurance company is going to have to foot a $100,000 bill, and they don't want to do that. So their actuaries have crunched the numbers and they said, you know what? It's actually more cost effective. It's actually much more logical to address this chronic disease as a chronic disease. And so that's what we're going to do. And despite the overwhelming evidence that addiction is a chronic disease, drug use disorders are the only disorders that I'm aware of that we don't treat that way. So what would it look like to really conceptualize addiction as a chronic disorder and then to help people recover that way? I really believe that that answer lies in recovery capital. So starting with the figure on the right, this is kind of just a helpful diagram that I've created. It's not super fancy, obviously, but it just helps you think about different dimensions. And it helps you think about that mortar that I talked about, all the stuff in between the bricks that we take for granted. We think, oh my goodness, it's such an accomplishment to get someone to the front door of a treatment center. But if on the other side of 30 days, they're going to have an inadequately healed brain and no resources, that's a joke. And it's offensive, and it's actually a disservice to that person to provide them a lack of evidence-based care and false hope. Recovery capital helps remind us the importance of social connections. I leveraged so much of my privilege. I didn't see it that way as a young person. I didn't understand it that way, but I got older and I realized I leveraged so many opportunities. I got jobs I didn't deserve. I got housing I didn't deserve because I knew people, because people knew my family, really, to be honest, because people knew my daddy, right? And I always put recovery capital next to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because even if you're not familiar with recovery capital, you're probably familiar with Maslow. And remember that what Maslow said is not just that basic needs have to be met, but they have to be met in order. And the reason I love that is because Maslow talked about reaching your full potential. And ironically, that's a part of the language of the definition of recovery, according to SAMHSA. You all probably know it. It's a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So in many ways, for me, I use Maslow's hierarchy as a hierarchy of recovery. And we know that in order, the foundational element then of recovery is going to be the same basic needs. And the reason I think this is funny is because we act like people who use drugs and people with substance use disorders are aliens from another planet. We act like people like me are more unlike other human beings than we are alike. And of course, that's wildly untrue. The reality is 99.99% of my needs are the same as yours. They're the same fundamental human needs, and they're not being addressed. And in fact, in many cases, they're not addressed because I'm a person who used drugs. And as a result, I'm deprived of these things, right? Deprived of housing, deprived of access to emergency shelters in some cases, whatever it might be. Recovery capital helps ground us in the fundamentals. And what it does, the reason recovery capital leads to recovery or remission, the reason it's such an important foundational building block is because it reduces stress. So think about any resource on the list, anything from housing to transportation to you get somebody a new job, a pay increase, a better employment environment. Any of those things reduces stress, reduces cortisol levels, which is going to make it easier for people to be a good employee. It's going to make it less likely that it compromises their parenting, right? It's going to put them in a position to succeed. And that's why I know that my privileged experience made such a difference. I had access to all of the things to reduce the stress. I didn't have to worry about rent for the first year. And that's true at all. That's an incredible gift. That's an incredible advantage to reduce stress. And yet we have a problem. And I think this is a really important tension. So hopefully you haven't checked out quite yet, because I still have 7 minutes and I intend to use all of them. My first job, I'm going to give you my example of my analogy for recovery capital. My first job in recovery was working in a tobacco field for UK. And we would develop these, grow the tobacco in a greenhouse. And the greenhouse was this astonishing environment where it was climate controlled and the plants had steady access to sunlight and water and nutrients, and they would just shoot up. And when they reached a sufficient level of maturation, we would transition them into trailers and load them out, take them out to a field and set the tobacco. And if we set the tobacco in good soil, it would transplant pretty effortlessly. And if we set it in low-lying areas that got too much rainwater or too little sunlight, it would wilt and die, right? This is my analogy for the difference between treatment and recovery, and it really, really matters. Treatment centers are like greenhouses, right? Greenhouses are like treatment centers in that they're climate-controlled environments for recovery. You have all the recovery capital in the world when you're a resident at a treatment center. You have educated counselors, you have peer support and 12-step meetings, you have nutritious meals, you have structure to your day, you have mental health support, every kind of intervention under the sun that we already know promotes recovery. It's all right there, right? So it's no wonder that people really tend to have tons of success while they're in inpatient treatment. The problem is that unlike the plants, which were sufficiently matured when we let them out of the greenhouse, we're taking people who have 30 days of recovery, utterly addicted brains, we're transitioning them back into the community, setting them in god-awful soil, and then we're like the stupid farmer who's standing over the plant, yelling at the plant, who can't understand why it didn't live and thrive, when it's so obvious. So really quickly, with my last couple minutes, let's take a step back out of recovery capital and think about how we've tried to address addiction over the last 50 years or so. So we started with a war on drugs, at least in 1971, when Nixon declared war on drugs. And the focus of this approach was we're going to address addiction in a jail cell. And it didn't work. And starting about 2000, with the age of some of this brain science, we recognized, hey, this isn't a criminal problem, this is a medical problem. And we saw the advent of all the progressive alternatives to incarceration, drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts, et cetera. This was a step in the right direction. This is effectively the model that we have today. It's a completely treatment-centric model. But the problem is that means that all of the recovery capital is stuck in the treatment centers. And all of the people who use drugs and all of the people who have substance use disorders are back in their community. And they don't have access to the things that they need because they had to leave it behind at the treatment center. So the model that we're trying to move toward are what are called ROSCs. I call them ROSCs because I have a hard time saying the word oriented after the word recovery, but you can read it for yourself off the screen. The focal point of the first approach was addressing addiction in a jail cell, didn't work. Focal point of the second approach is addressing addiction in a treatment center, and I want to suggest to you all that it is not working. 108,000 people overdosed and died of completely preventable death in 2021. That is not a sign of a successful treatment industry, right? Where we want to go is towards ushering all of those resources into communities where people live, where people have access. And just so I don't risk a treatment provider on here thinking that I'm disparaging treatment, please understand that I'm not at all. Treatment saved my life. Treatment is a critical part of the infrastructure, and that's why you see it right there in ROSCs, highlighted in yellow. It's one of the many resources that's needed, but it's not the focus. Our world doesn't revolve around getting people into treatment. Our world revolves around getting people the resources that they need at home, where they're insulated from the stress that drives relapse, and extensively over that period of time, right? So that's what we do at Voices of Hope. Voices of Hope is just an example of recovery capital in the community. We don't measure our programs by abstinence or reductions in drug use or anything like that. We measure our programs in terms of recovery capital. Are we building capital for the people we care about? And I realize I'm flying and in some sense jumping from one thing to the next, but close your eyes. I'm going to speed through a couple of slides to get to one final slide here that I want to share with you, and then we'll be done. I just want to give my 2-3 minute defense of harm reduction. In some circles, it's a dirty word, and I know to most social workers it isn't, but I just wanted to make a case and maybe help you see an aspect of harm reduction, an advantage of harm reduction that's not often talked about. Because there's really two kinds of harm reduction, lowercase and uppercase. And lowercase harm reduction is the one you're probably most familiar with. It's the practical strategies that reduce the consequences of drug use. It reduces the harms. So it's syringe service programs, medications for opioid use disorder, naloxone, you know all those, safe consumption sites. They're kind of efficacious on their face. It's on its face, it's easy to see why reducing the spread of disease in our community is a good thing that everyone should care about, right? But I want to make the case from the capital HR as a movement for social justice, a belief in a respect for the rights of people who use drugs. That doesn't mean we believe everyone should just be able to use drugs willy-nilly as they please. What it means is we believe that at the point that a person begins using drugs, they haven't relinquished their human rights, their very human rights. And so here's the advantage of harm reduction. Hopefully you all are familiar with these stages of change, Prochaska and Di Clemente, right? You got to go through these stages. Well, under our current treatment paradigm, the model that we have right now today, the only way that we can be effective with people, the only people that we can be effective with are the folks who are right here. The entire treatment apparatus is essentially abstinence-based, which means the only people who we can effectively get into treatment are people who are abstinent or ready for abstinence and ready for abstinence today. And as the National Survey on Drug Use and Health shows year after year, most people are not interested in abstinence, and certainly not abstinence today with no flexibility. What that means is the majority, you can locate the majority of the people who use drugs in your community somewhere on this spectrum, and the majority of them are unengaged. The majority of them are just community dwelling and suffering. The advantage of harm reduction, the true advantage of harm reduction is engagement, is that it allows you to focus on connection first so that you can engage the otherwise unengaged. You can engage the most marginalized in your community. And in fact, you can work magic. You can work with people who don't even believe that they have a problem with substances. Even people who have undeniable SUD, who are in deep denial or deep ambivalence, doesn't matter. You can still work with them because the goal doesn't have to be abstinence. The goal can be a reduction of use. The goal can be a safer route of administration. The goal can be using when you have someone around so we can keep you alive. I mean, the list goes on and on. I know I'm basically at time. I'm going to finish with one last story here, and then I'm happy to take questions for as long as folks have them or would like to stay on, but I know some of you all are here for CEUs and got to go. So just to drive home the point about this, why harm reduction is such an advantageous approach, this is a note that one of our participants gave us at Voices of Hope, and I think it tells the story really beautifully. She talked about how she used to push her cart. She was experiencing homelessness. She was an IV drug user, pushing her cart day after day after day past the center. And every day she passed our center, our sign out front says Recovery Center. Recovery Community Center is what it says. And so every time she saw that, to her, the word recovery meant abstinence. And so she thought, I surely am not ready to stop using drugs. That must not be for me. And so she walked past us and she walked past us and she walked past us. And then one day she heard through word of mouth, someone on the street told her that she could do her laundry at Voices of Hope for free. And that the only barrier, the only thing she had to do was to sit through one recovery coaching session. That's it. And if she'd sit through a recovery coaching session, she could do her laundry for free. And she thought that's pretty low barrier to save $8 on laundry or whatever. And so she started doing her laundry at our center. And she's on foot, so she can't do the laundry and leave. So now she's putting in her laundry and spending 3 or 4 hours each laundry day hanging out at a recovery community center. And she's hanging out with people who have a harm reduction philosophy, not people who are telling her, get out of here until you're ready to quit using drugs. Come back when you're open-minded and willing and honest. Instead, what they said was, we love you right as you are. I'm really glad you're here. Can I get you a cup of coffee? What can I connect you with? And that happened for about 2 to 3 weeks until the woman came to our recovery coach and said, I want to go to treatment. And the great irony to me of the whole story, the outcome of this story is, not only is this person in recovery, which is great, she's in abstinence-based recovery. And even though I don't prioritize abstinence-based recovery above anything else, I think it's a unique outcome to this story. Because if we had been all about abstinence up front, she wouldn't be abstinent today. Does that make sense? Instead, it's because we were willing to focus on engagement. It's because the relationship with her, the ability for her to do her laundry, was more important than shaming her drug use. And that allowed us to have a connection, build a rapport, get her in a position where she really thinks, yeah, maybe this is possible for me. So I just wanted to make that final plea because I think sometimes harm reduction is a little bit misunderstood and mischaracterized, and I'm a big fan and a big believer. Let's see, I think I can start working back through questions in the chat. I also put up my, my email in case you all have specific questions, if you want access to some specific research, or you just want to have a conversation, if you just want to connect. I'd love to connect with you all. I love to do that. So just give me just a second. I'm moving through. First question I saw is thoughts on decriminalization of substance use, not legalization. And it's a great question. And actually, in one of the classes I teach in the Honors College here at University of Kentucky, we debate that. We spend a considerable amount of time really considering the available evidence, which is largely kind of light. So in many senses, the first thing I always say when I'm asked this question, because it's a great question and it's fascinating, is in many senses, it's theoretical. It's conceptual for us here in the States because it's really hard to have a sense of what it would look like. Of course, with the exception of Oregon, which is exercising that right now. But so with that caveat, what I would say is, I believe firmly in at least the decriminalization of substances. I believe the harm that's done by the war on drugs, incarcerating people who use drugs, who aren't bad people, they're really just disproportionately mentally ill and have disproportionate amounts of trauma and genetic predisposition, right? I think the harm done by the criminal justice system far outweighs the benefit that we get, any benefit at all derived from illicit drugs. I think the research shows pretty clearly there will be a moderate increase in drug use when drugs are decriminalized, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an increase in harmful drug use, which I know for many of us is hard to separate. But the reality is 90% of folks who use any substance use it successfully, use it without becoming addicted. So not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but that's a great question. And that's kind of what comes to my, my thoughts first. Let me see. Yeah, Chris asked, I'm assuming looking at the slide of recovery rates, is there a reason that females have a higher percentage of sustained recovery than males? And two things, I mean, that's a great observation. Number one, those data are taken from one specific study. So it wasn't a nationally representatively sample, population-based sample. So those numbers probably have a little noise, a little wiggle room. They're probably not perfect. But it was a long-term study in a big cohort, so it's fairly reliable data. And there are, I think, a number of different explanations. I think yours are as good as any. I don't really know. One of them is being male is considered a risk factor for addiction, in a sense, because we metabolize substances differently. And I don't know a whole lot more about that. speak about that in an educated way, so you can look into that a little bit more. But that would be one of the first things that comes to mind for me. Yes, Abraham Maslow wins again. Let's see. Yeah, and so someone asked about the spiritual aspect of addiction, and that fits neatly, really neatly into a recovery capital model. If I can go back, just give me 1 second while you bear with me. I'll be there shortly. Recovery capital, collective recovery capital. So sometimes in the literature, it's called cultural recovery capital, which sometimes I think helps us understand how spirituality fits in there better, because it's a way of saying, and we're understanding this more and more, that treatment of all kinds, not just in the addiction space, but in any space, mental health, anywhere, needs to be culturally appropriate. And so much of the treatment industry is really just predicated on white dominant culture, the experiences of people like me. And that doesn't always meet the needs of communities of color, of the Latinx community. So just by way of example, we did a series of listening sessions with the Latinx community in Lexington. And one of the surprising things that was really obvious that came out of that is 100% of the 15 people in the room told us that if their child or their loved one were addicted, the first place they would go for help is to their pastor at their church. And that's not the experience of the average white person. Some people may go for spiritual support, but certainly most people would go to a primary care provider or to a treatment center. So I think that's just an example of how it's really important that our pathways of recovery fit everyone's experience and not just people like me. You know, AA has a chapter. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, and I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just trying to kind of open your eyes in some sense. AA has a chapter called To the Wives. It's a total implicit assumption that the alcoholic, the person with the alcohol use disorder, is male, is in a heterosexual relationship, and that the wife is the one who's a codependent. It doesn't suppose that they could be gay. It doesn't suppose that even that the female could be a person who has the alcohol use disorder. So it's just an example of like, there are problems that I think we could acknowledge in the system in that way. Let's see. Lots of nice things. Thank you all for that. Should acknowledge that for sure. I just want to make sure I answer any remaining questions. Sarah asked, how do we social work and care coordinators get higher up management, physicians, to get to the point of understanding addiction at this level? That's a great question. I think it's a real important form of advocacy. I was just reading an article this morning, ironically, on my mom sent it to me, on addiction literacy, which is kind of what you're talking about. Like, it's wild how many of us have our stakeholders, our decision makers who impact the lives of people who use drugs and don't know anything, don't really have a very elementary understanding of the problem, and therefore an elementary understanding of what solutions might work. I think trainings are important. I think I'd be happy to do it if you'd invite me to come and share with your administration or your physicians. I do trainings for doctors and lawyers and judges and physicians and nurses, and I go anywhere I'm invited because I think it's the most important kind of advocacy that I can do. I've gone to Frankfurt, in Kentucky. I've gone to Washington, D.C. I just don't think that's where I'm best positioned to have impact. I think this is where I'm supposed to be. So if I can help you, or if I can connect you with someone else who can, definitely shoot me an email, please. I think I've got through questions there. So thank you all so much. If there are any other questions, like I said, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'll return to that slide. And I hope even for those of you who are longtime experts in the field, who have been around, I know sometimes it's annoying. You feel like you're talked down to when you hear the same things over and over again, but hopefully some of this is just reinforcement that just really kind of solidifies things that you already understand.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation. A lot of really good information. Just as a reminder, the Recovery Summit is going on all month with different topics and speakers planned each weekday. Monday's presentation will be at 1 p.m. presented by Denise Kolakowski from Poison Control on poison prevention, cannabis, and drug safety. To see information and register for additional sessions, please visit sccmh.org under the Events tab and Recovery Summit. Individuals requesting professional credits, you will receive your certificate of accumulated credits by October 30th via email. As a reminder, please complete the short survey at the conclusion of the webinar. Thank you again to our presenter, Dr. Elswick. Your time and information is appreciated. And thank you all to all who attended today's session. Have a great day.